Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to participate in today's debate. As Joe Fitzpatrick mentioned earlier, I was a member of the committee, I think, for all but one of the evidence sessions until I moved on to pastures new. So in some way, participating in today's debate brings a degree of closure. As a long-standing supporter of the living wage and indeed an activist for the living wage, it's a very welcome experience.
Ms Dugdale, could you move your microphone round slightly? Thank you very much.
Better? Sorry, Presiding Officer. I commend the work of the convener and his assiduous deputy, all members of the committee, the clerks and those who gave evidence for the production of what I believe to be a good report which states broad support for the living wage. I think to conclude today's debate, there are 3 Ps to talk of: poverty, pay, procurement and political will. And I'd like to talk a little bit about each in turn. But before I do that, I'd like to make some remarks about Margaret Mitchell's speech. Now, there were a number of ideological areas of Margaret Mitchell's speech that I disagree with. And there's not really the time to go into that, but I would like to disagree with her on an element of fact in her speech. She quoted the CBI's written evidence to the committee, and she said the impact would fall most heavily on young people, with international evidence showing that they face disproportionate exposure to the negative employment effects of a minimum wage. That's what CBI Scotland's evidence said to the committee, and it was followed with a footnote, reference 1, and that referenced a low pay commission report, which actually says something completely different. It says, the evidence suggested that minimum wages were more likely to have a negative effect on the youth labour market where there were no separate rates for younger workers. Now, Ms Mitchell and others will realise that there are differential rates for the national minimum wage in our country, so that does not apply in this case. Not only is that a fact of the matter, but the Low Pay Commission report goes on to say, furthermore, the impact could indeed be positive if youth rates were set at an appropriate level, and any adverse effect could disappear or become less negative if there were strong labour market interventions by the government to support young people into work. So I'm afraid I find CBI's written evidence disingenuous, and I appreciate that some members of the committee raised that at this stage, and I'm a little sorry to see the CBI's evidence referenced in paragraph 131 of the report, because I think it is to a degree misleading. Back to those, of course.
Gavin Brown.
By the same token, at page 4 of the committee report, the Low Pay Commission report 2011 are quoted as saying that it did find some evidence to suggest that young people may have been adversely affected by the minimum wage, especially in a recession. That's directly from the committee report.
Kezia Dugdale.
I think the impacts of your government are having a far greater effect on the incomes of young people at the moment than that particular comment. However, Presiding Officer, back to the issue of the 3 Ps. My colleague Sarah Boyack opened this debate talking about poverty pay and the experience of people in these tough economic times, the squeeze on family budgets, the pressures of rising costs, and the increasing number of people who find themselves living in poverty despite the fact that they work. And for someone who believes that work is the best way out of poverty, that is extremely worrying. And I think those points were best made by John Pentland in what I thought was a particularly powerful speech. The Minister, in his opening remarks, talked about the fact that now half of the 32 local authorities across Scotland now pay the living wage. I'm sorry to disappoint him, but one of those is not, sadly, the SNP-led council in Edinburgh. So I think it was a little bit cheeky of Colin Keir to have a go at Alison Johnstone in that regard. But I can assure the Chamber that when Edinburgh Labour win in May, that will be rectified, because we have a clear commitment to the living wage in our manifesto. On the issue of procurement, Presiding Officer, my colleague John Park spoke about this at length, and it's an issue I know that he is very well versed in, and will bring more to the Chamber on this in the future. I recently visited the Commonwealth Games organisation in Glasgow to see how they were getting along with regards to creating jobs for young people through procurement processes. But it's worth remembering that the Commonwealths are actually a living wage games, and I think that will address a lot of the issues at the moment around hospitality, which my colleague Anne McTaggart addressed. And I also welcome the remarks that John Wilson made in this regard. On to the issue of political will, I'd like to talk briefly about the living wage unit. And the committee report addresses this in quite a great deal of detail, and indeed John Swinney gave evidence to the committee, and in his evidence he talked about the number of different government departments which currently consider pay issues. He talked about procurement, the Employability Directorate, the Pay Policy Directorate, the Finance Directorate, and all the different people within the third sector within the government that have to deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis. And he thought that because there were so many different organisations involved, it would be a bad solution to, in his mind, compartmentalise the solution into one government department. I'm afraid that completely misses the point. That's exactly why we need a living wage unit, because there are so many different aspects of government talking about this without the necessary coordination to go forward with it. I'm sorry, I'm in my last minute. So, Presiding Officer, it's the political will that we would like to see more of from the SNP. We agree with the rhetoric. There is more to be done. And my final plea to the Minister would be to recognise that his work is not indeed done, even when 32 of 32 local authorities delivered the living wage, because this is about uprating. It's about a year-on-year commitment to make sure that the living wage value is always with us. And I hope he can comment on that in his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. I now call